So welcome everyone, pleased to be here. Andy Fawcett and myself and David Frudd. So we've got a two-part presentation for you. Go to the next slide. Let's have a bit of a conversation about FinancialForce, very brief. We were native to the Salesforce platform since 2009. Our investors are Salesforce themselves, Advent and Unit 4. We're around 660 employees right now, so growing quite rapidly over the years, and around 1,000 plus customers in 34 countries. A little bit briefly about our apps. We are an ERP suite. We have some professional services apps, financial management and HCM capital management. We also integrate with CRM as well. So if you want to know a little bit more about our apps, a bit more about FinancialForce, I'd love to talk to you after the sessions or go to our website to learn a bit more. So the session itself is about open source, and I find it actually quite a nice connection with the previous session because we're going to talk, at least in the first part here, about what is open source and how do you get started. And a good part of getting started in open source marries with a lot of the discussion that we had earlier about how you market your open source repositories or how you get involved with the open source community. So it's a really good session to follow on from the previous one. And afterwards, David's going to talk to us about some new features in our Apex Common and Apex Mox open source repositories. So the developers in the room will enjoy learning a bit about some of the new features that have been actually contributed by the community into those libraries. So open source, what is it? How do I get started? So the definition of open source from Wikipedia I've drawn here talks about open source being computer software. It's available on the internet, has a license, and the copyright holder provides the rights to study, change, distribute that software. The general spirit of open source is that we're collaborating on it. We're looking at the source code, we're saying what are the needs, and any developer around the world can contribute to that. There's obviously a process involved. You can't just go in and start editing the code. We'll talk about some of the tools involved in open source. And generally what happens is you get very different diverse opinions on what the tool or particular thing you're building needs to do, or ideas around it. You're not just focusing on one central group of people thinking about it. You're getting a lot of diversity about what the tool or the direction the code needs to go in. Next slide. What you want to look for before you go ahead and start pulling down every single open source repository that you can find is think about the licensing of it. It is generally free for you to use, but you may need to declare, most commonly you'll need to declare that you're using it. You may need to contribute any changes back to it. If you make changes, usually there's a clause that asks you to contribute changes back. If you use the software, you may only be able to use it in free circumstances yourself. So if it's an actual chargeable product, there may be some clauses that control whether you can use it and still charge for your software. So I'm not a legal guy. Do seek your own advice. These are some highlights of the things to think about. There is actually a really good article on the Open Source Initiative website that talks about the different licenses and makes it a really easy way to understand it, gets rid of some of the legal mumbo jumbo, makes it kind of boils it down to what some of the stuff you want to know about. So check out that link. Once you've got past some of the licensing stuff and you've decided you want to try and take a look at an open source repository, look at for activity. Are people changing it, or is it just kind of withered away? Is the last few changes 2 or 3 years ago, nobody's really paying attention to it? Is it stable? So it might have a lot of changes to it, but is it actually got any bugs in it? Or how stable is it? Are people just working on it now? Is it in prototype form? So you can look to see if there's any continuous integration, and continuous integration is a mechanism where you could see maybe by a label that says this is a stable build, which means all the tests have been run and are currently passing, and that gives you some good confidence about it. How many open and closed issues are against it? So even if you were kind of, much in the same way you might assess a software product, have a look in open source to see whether or not there's a number of open issues and how many are closed, because that gives you a kind of idea of turnover. It's not necessarily a bad thing if there's a load of open issues, but if there's kind of not so many closed ones, it kind of gives you a different feel about it. So look for the kind of turnover of issues. Lastly, figure out whether people are talking about it. If people are saying, hey, I think it's a really good idea, or here's some feedback about it, and you're seeing it in forums, that also gives you good confidence about it. So don't just pick an open source library because it happens to meet your needs. It might have done at one point, but it might be a bit of a dead end in terms of activity. So I did actually have a little survey on Twitter before this session and asked the community, you guys, about what some of your favourite open source libraries were. And you might recognise some of these and might think, well, I didn't know that was open source. Personally, I'd heard a lot about the non-profit starter pack, but actually only relatively recent years figured out that it's actually open source. You can actually go in and contribute to that. And it's a massively complicated application, lots of lines of code, all driven through an open source initiative. Sockle Explorer has been around for a while. SLDS represents some really good Lightning components that you could use and download into your orgs. Enforce, we're getting into sort of more JavaScript type frameworks. Next slide. RESTforce, more toolkits. Workbench, how many people have used the Salesforce Workbench tool? Yeah, so that's open source. Features that you've used in that, you think, well, I wish it did that better. Well, get in there, create a pull request, make the changes, and submit it back. Some really interesting ones that are up and coming is PMD Apex, which is actually static code analysis, which has been something that's been sorely lacking in Apex for a very long time. And some innovative developers have started contributing to PMD, which is actually non-Salesforce specific. PMD is a technology for scanning code of different languages, and they've written an Apex plugin to that, which has made it open to things like Force.com IDE, there's GitHub integration, and it'll give you all sorts of analytics about your code, you know, wasted methods, whether the code's too complex, that type of stuff. Salesforce's mobile SDK, the whole framework which the mobile apps are based on, is actually open source. When you're running Salesforce One Mobile, that app, or even building your own apps, it's the same framework. So that's open source as well. The IDE, we all love and hate our favorite IDEs, Maven's Mate, Developer Console, Force.com IDE. This particular one is having a bit of a resurgence. In the past it was very closed, Salesforce worked on it, and now they've made it open source. So if there's a feature of that you really wanted, revisit this IDE and think about whether or not you can contribute to that. And there is a lot of effort going into that new IDE. Aura itself, you might not have heard the term, it's kind of linked with Lightning from days of old. It's been superseded by a lot of new branding, but is actually the fundamental framework of Lightning. It's the core library, the core runtime environment Lightning uses. And Salesforce have open sourced effectively part of their platform, which is a pretty cool thing to do. So some good projects to take a look at. If you're interested in running your own open source project, think about the repositories you want to run it from. Which ones are commonly used in your community? So if we're talking about Salesforce, the one I most commonly see is GitHub. There's other ones like Bitbucket, SourceForge, things like that. Think about whether it's free. Obviously, if it's something you're doing in your own time, hosting your own code, you don't really necessarily want it to be a draw on your bank balance every month. If it's free, think about the tools around it as well. Don't just think about whether it will store your code. Most of them will do that. But has it got any tools for managing wikis and user and issues and managing those things? So once you get something out there, you'll need to work with the community and have a neat way of managing all the issues and logging them and closing them and tagging them. And GitHub has a really good facility for doing all of that. So decide on your license file as well. That's really important. If you're creating an open source project, figure out, as per the previous slide, what type of license you want to associate with it. There are some that would just sort of say, I don't really care, you use it for whatever you want to do, but if it brings your world to an end, don't come back to me because I'm not liable. So there are some licenses that will fit for all sorts of situations. So if GitHub in its kind of full-blown form isn't something that's of interest to you, one thing that's a part of GitHub is called Gist, and it's a good way of taking little fragments of code and putting them into kind of a mini version of GitHub. It's not a full-blown repository, but it's lighter to use. You literally go to the website, paste in your code, and it'll give you a URL you can put on your blog to share the code. And you can also update that code afterwards, and you can see kind of revision history behind it. So it's good for short blogs. You can always move it to a repository later. So if you're kind of not sure about GitHub and managing all that stuff, GitHub Gist is kind of a good starting point for you to host some of your code fragments. So much in the same kind of sense that we were talking earlier, think about ways to promote your repository. Sometimes a repository that I look at doesn't get the message across to me straight away when I click on it, because it starts launching into kind of how to use it and how the code works and some code samples. And I'm kind of left wondering, if the name isn't that obvious, what is it? What's the problem it's trying to solve? What's the domain issue? What's some of the use cases? So first and foremost, state what the problem is you're trying to solve here, because that'll draw people in. So have I got that problem? Yeah, I've got that. Then I'll read on. So treat it like your shop front. It's almost like a mini blog in a way. Give them ways to get started and engage with the community. There are some great tools, not just in GitHub, but Salesforce itself lets anybody create a chatter group in the community. So you could have a chatter group for your open source repository and let people engage with you through that. Don't underestimate showing some screenshots, even if it's code samples or even some screenshots. Gives people some visuals about what they're going to get if they start using this code. Do consider repeating your license at the bottom of your README file. It's always a good idea to put your license in the repository, but you can repeat it at the bottom of your README file as well, because people might print that or scroll to the bottom. So know who you're targeting is another important thing. Sometimes you can actually target multiple audiences. It could be primarily developers, but if you've got kind of administrators looking for types of problems, although they might not be able to consume the contents of your open source project, they might know a developer who could. So try and target different people in terms of what they're wanting to get out of your solution, and provide ways of targeting those audiences. So not everybody knows about command lines or IDEs. There are some good ways to get your contents of your repository into a Salesforce org really easily. You could either use a button, a Salesforce deploy button, which will show on the next slide, or you could create a package. And a package is, in some respects, quite an easy thing to create, but gives us an easy link to install directly into your Salesforce org. It takes a bit of overhead for you to manage that, because you have to kind of link it with your repository and the package. But it helps people kind of lower the barrier to entry in terms of getting hold of what's in your repository. Okay, next slide. Oh, there we go, bit of buffering. So click's not command line. So it is a little bit of a gracious plug, because this is a tool I've created myself, but it has been really popular for people wanting to easily deploy the contents of their GitHub repository. You basically put a button in your README file, they click that and they get taken to a login screen to log into Salesforce, and then it will start deploying that code. So they don't have to download the repository, figure out how to use Git, use some IDE or Ant command line tool, because by which time, if they're a new developer, they're probably not familiar with those tools anyway, but they just want to try it out. So this gives you a really sort of easy way to get it from the GitHub repository into your Salesforce org. Some other interesting tools. Travis is an open framework. There's a chargeable version of it for free repositories, open source projects. You can use Travis, and this gives you that kind of assurance that there's a quality element to what's in your repository. You see the little build passing there. That will tell them that all your tests that's in your repository and your code is stable. The current build stable, and it's pretty clever because it'll update dynamically each time you change your code. It'll kick off a new build in the background, and it'll show in progress, and they'll failed or passed accordingly. If you want to learn more about it, I have included a little link there that shows you how to set Travis up. This one is pretty interesting. It's linked with the PMD thing I was talking about earlier. Code Climate is an existing framework. It's used for Java. Other languages available, but now also Apex through the plugin that the other communities have been contributing. And it'll allow you to do static analysis on the contents of your repository. Ultimately, you don't have to know Git, which is a command line technology for moving code in and out of repositories. There's a great client for it for Windows and Mac. I use it all the time, and it's a really easy way of getting code in and out of your repository and merging contributions. So some tools that will really sort of help you along the way for repositories. And finally, manage your contributions. It can take a while to get contributions coming into your repositories, because it could take up to a year or more. It depends on adoption rate. You really need to sort of bring people in, get people talking about it and using it for ideas and other people's contributions to formulate. Drive it yourself, but don't be surprised if you have to keep doing that for quite a while until you can get some contributions coming in. So the term pull request basically refers to, it's a GitHub term, it's all about sort of people say, here's some code, can you pull it into your repository so that you can merge it with the main project. So these requests help contributions, you merge those in, and then finally give some credit to those folks, Twitter, Chatter, blogs, that type of stuff. Again, we're sort of talking about some of the points we had in the previous session. Do give contribution thanks, that's really important, because other people say, well, that guy's contributing, then I could contribute. You know, maybe I could do that. It kind of starts to snowball a little bit. So from a business point of view, obviously FinancialForce has some open source repositories. David's going to take you through some of those contributions and new things we've got there. It can help showcase your developer skills. You know, obviously, as a business selling an application, you don't put your source code out on the internet. But if you decide there are some elements of your products that you want to share, it gives people a little snippet, a little insight into kind of the quality of your developers. And it can also help with recruitment. There has been one or two cases recently with FinancialForce where people have come to us because they're seeing us in the community and they're seeing the type of code that we're writing and they're interested in working for us. So that can help with recruitment. And of course, it's great to be social, you know. So do it with balance, have a process. If you're going to do it as an organization, make sure your senior management behind it, and also there's a process so that people understand what's good to share and what's not good to share. Otherwise, it'll go really bad very quickly if people start sharing things that they shouldn't.